and welcome to Your Coaching Journey, a podcast for doctors about coaching. Whether you're a coaching doctor, a doctor who is learning to coach, or a doctor who would like to build coaching into your professional life, then this is the podcast for you.
Hello, I'm Tom Dillon, and with me today is my colleague and podcast co-host Helen Leathers. Today we're going to be taking our first look at issues that might arise in the coaching room. So what are we going to be talking about today, Helen?
Well, Tom, in today's episode, I'd like to discuss boundaries, and I'm going to offer my thoughts on why it's an important issue for us to address with clients and ways in which we might help them set some boundaries and learn to maintain them.
Lovely. So let's get started then. I know boundaries is a common issue that you work with. So how do boundaries show up in the coaching room for you?
So an issue around boundary setting tends to manifest as individuals taking on too much at work. So they're really, really busy all the time doing everything. Or it might be at home where they end up doing everything or more than their fair share of housework, caring duties, etc. So there's often a struggle with work-life balance as well. And very commonly, it might be as simple as not having the time to do the basic things for themselves that should be a given, like sleeping properly or enough, or eating a meal without rushing, or perhaps even eating at all, just rushing in and out and forgetting to eat. Or it might be not having the time to see friends or family or have some fun in their life.
Okay, so when people come to the coaching room, how self-aware are they that they need to work on their boundaries?
I would say that about 50% of clients with issues around boundaries know they need to work on it. They tell me when we initially have a conversation that that's something they want to explore. There might be some other stuff in there as well, but often they'll say, and I need to learn to say no, or I need to learn to work on my boundaries. The other half don't quite realise that what they're experiencing might be due at least in part to issues with boundaries. So they might just be feeling resentful or a little bit irritable a lot of the time. They might be feeling put upon by a person or a lot of people. They might just be too busy. And when we explore these things more, when we dig down, we realise that perhaps they haven't put boundaries in place. Or they might have assumed they've put boundaries in place, but they've never actually communicated them. So we then know that that's something that we need to work on.
And when you start working with clients on their boundaries, how do you begin that process with them?
Well, the first thing that I really love to do, because it really builds in some confidence, is to identify an area where they are good at setting and maintaining boundaries, whether that's now or in the past, because very often people focus on the things they're not good at, and they can learn a lot from the areas that they are better at. So quite often they might be good at setting boundaries at home but not at work, or vice versa. There'll always be somewhere or some time when they've had an experience of putting a boundary in place, and we can pull through learnings from that and also confidence that it's actually something they can do. We also look at the areas where they struggle with setting and maintaining boundaries. And we explore beliefs around boundaries, what might be influencing them, learned beliefs, things that have been demonstrated to them from the people growing up, the people that they socialise with, around what setting boundaries might mean. And we explore the consequences of the issues they have around not setting boundaries and the benefits of doing so. And often exploring the benefits particularly can unlock things for people. It can give them a more confident attitude to setting some ground rules going forward.
Good. So you mentioned a moment ago that beliefs is something that you work with, and quite often in the coaching room we have people that show up with quite limiting beliefs. So what are some of the limiting beliefs that people have around boundaries?
Typically, I hear clients talk about wanting to be liked, that people-pleasing and not upsetting people. So they perhaps fail to put boundaries in place because they don't want to be seen as awkward or upsetting others. They often think that having those conversations about boundaries are confrontational rather than just a conversation, and they tend not to like that and want to avoid that. They just don't want to be causing a scene, if you like. Some of the women that I work with also just don't have the confidence to speak up. They might have been, as they see it, poor at boundary setting for many years, and they don't have that inner confidence to say, I want this to change. I don't like this anymore. In fact, I've never liked this. This needs to change. Another big factor is that they often don't think it's okay to ask for help, or there is this perception that they should be able to cope with everything, so they take on everything. They try to do everything, and it's seen as failure if they can't manage all of that. So they'll often reach burnout before they even start to think that it's okay for them to ask for help or set boundaries. And I think this is probably very true for medical professionals. I've worked with professionals in the NHS who were heading for or have even experienced burnout, and it's just seen as the norm. And setting boundaries comes after the burnout, which of course is a big problem.
Yes, and I've noticed that with medical professionals going through our courses, the reason that they don't set boundaries, quite often they'll refer to the pressure of patient care, that they have to do it for the patients. But more often than not, when we get underneath that, it's about not wanting to upset their colleagues or not wanting to be seen as not being a team player. So it's more about the relationships they have with people around them than actually patient care.
And yet what happens if they end up off sick through exhaustion or burnout? Because someone else is going to have to take on that additional workload if that's the case.
Yeah. So leading on from that, you've mentioned there are consequences to not setting boundaries, but it would seem that there are likely to be consequences to people actually setting boundaries as well, because that's going to have an impact on the people around them, and they might well get some pushback from just telling people that they've set some boundaries. So how do you work with your coachees around that aspect of setting boundaries?
Absolutely, and this work probably should come with a bit of a warning, which I do give clients. We do explore this when we're going through this aspect of boundary setting. What we have to remember is we teach people how to treat us and what we'll put up with, and we might have done that for a long time. So when that changes, perhaps we're no longer prepared to keep working overtime, for example. We change the rules of engagement. So it's really important to have a conversation about what's happened in the past and acknowledge that. And it's often something that I will encourage clients to role play, to acknowledge that past, explain why it needs to change, and to put things in place for the future. And that does help to mitigate the consequences. But what's quite interesting is that in many cases, and I found this when I first started setting boundaries in my personal life, when we state our boundaries or when we say no, it's actually not that earth-shattering. The world doesn't end. It's often simply accepted by people around us. And then we wonder, oh, why didn't I do that before? I've been putting up with this all this time, and all I needed to do was say no or say something needs to change. But sometimes there is a period of adjustment, of readjustment, not just for you as the boundary setter, but of the people around you. So it is a good idea to start small and get some practice at it to build confidence before moving on to bigger things that may potentially have bigger consequences.
Yes, so what's next once you've explored those topics with your coachee?
So that's quite a lot of background and deep work, and once we've looked at all of those, we start to identify a specific issue, whether it's a small one or a slightly larger one, where they need to set a boundary. And I encourage them to actually find a powerful reason why boundaries need to be put in place or enforced, and to, from that why, create a powerful manifesto. And we know from work done by Simon Sinek, why is really important in helping us to understand our work and so on, our mission in life, and the why behind our boundary setting is equally as important. So, for example, if someone is always working and they feel guilty about that, they might give in to buying lots of toys for their child whenever they go shopping, and they might not necessarily be able to afford it, but their reasons for not putting boundaries in place around it might be around their own guilt. The consequences of that, which we would explore, could be financial, could be about creating an expectation in that child that they'll always get toys whenever they go to the shop or whenever they ask for them. So we might look for a new why and create a new manifesto. And that new why could be about keeping spending on budget and to teach children the value of money. So I like to use the phrase, and I know you like this phrase too, I choose to, so that. So their new manifesto could be, I choose to say no to toys for the children, so that I can teach them the value of money and the power of budgeting for something special in the future. This manifesto isn't something that needs to be shared with those children. It's an inner resource. It's an inner confidence that allows you then to say no and to keep that in force. So it's a deeper understanding behind the new ground rules. And I often find this is really the key to keeping that client feeling empowered and to feel confident about the changes they want to make. So then it's almost the easy part to identify the new boundary, what the consequences are if that boundary is breached, which is sometimes appropriate and sometimes not, and how to communicate these with the people around them.
Good. That all sounds very interesting. But I know from having children myself that children are very manipulative and they will pull on the heartstrings to get you to do things you don't think are a good idea, but you'll do them anyway because of the emotional aspect of it. So if you do find yourself, and we'll use the example of children, if you do find yourself giving it, maybe they've been ill and you've relinquished your boundaries because they've been ill and you've bought them toys or something. How do you deal with that once a coachee has gone back on the boundaries they've already set for themselves?
Yeah, firstly, I think it's really important not to simply give up and go back to the old way of being, because you've identified how important it is for the new boundaries. You've identified the consequences. So it's really important that one setback doesn't reverse all of that. And in other areas, someone might have spent the last 5 years doing the same thing, or even 10, 20, or perhaps 40 years of always behaving in a particular way, perhaps taking all the work home or doing the school run for everyone else. And just because something's been done for a long time doesn't mean it's not important to change that situation, but it does mean there's lots of unlearning to do and a lot of retraining of the person setting the boundaries, but also the retraining of people around them. So, it's almost perhaps expect to fall off the wagon, expect that there will be a setback. But if that happens and you allow someone to breach that boundary or you've given in, be kind to yourself, acknowledge, be proud that you've taken the first step, but allow yourself a bit of time to think about it, pick things back up and start again. You need good communication, honest conversations with those around you. And also enlisting the help of supportive people around you can help to stay on track as well. And maybe even, in the case of the children, communicating your personal manifesto in a way that they understand, perhaps with a future goal for spending that money that they'll be saving, that might help as well. So that communication is really key.
And if we go back to the idea that rather than giving in, we say, I choose to, so if it was with the children, then I'm choosing to do this, so that helps with the communication, helps get that message across, and people can actually understand rather than feeling that you're just being difficult. They understand why you're doing it. Good. Thank you for sharing that with us, Helen. That's been great. I'm sure that some of the listeners will be thinking about setting boundaries for themselves now. So what are your top tips to any of our listeners seeking to improve their boundary setting skills?
Yeah, my top tips would definitely be to start small. Identify something small that you can practice on, and that builds your confidence around boundaries. Just even asking to be seated at a different table in a restaurant when you've been shown to one that perhaps you're not comfortable with. That will really help to build your confidence. The other thing is practicing radical self-care. And I don't mean, spas and candlelit baths, basic self-care. This is about making sure you're well resourced from within and having the energy that you need, the nutrition, the sleep, the hydration, feeling good from the inside. This well, make sure that you're more likely to implement and maintain boundaries and say no. We know what it's like when we're exhausted, and we'll just go, oh, yeah, okay, whatever. And we'll end up taking more and more things on. Sometimes people are the opposite and snap, but usually it's the case that we take more on and don't say no when we're exhausted. So we really need to practice that radical self-care and get on track with feeling a bit more energised within ourselves. And I think the final top tip would be to think about boundaries as a way of showing people who you are and what you stand for. So they're a way of saying yes to your authentic self rather than no to someone else. And I think that can be in itself really powerful. When we get our head around that, we really can come from a confident place in setting our boundaries and saying no.
Excellent stuff, and that certainly ties into my approach to coaching, which is actually working with a person so that they can become more who they are. So if they can work with their boundaries to be more authentic, then I think that's great. So thank you. That's been really insightful.
You're welcome. It's a favourite topic of mine.
Next time on this podcast, we'll be answering some listeners' questions. You can always subscribe so you don't have to miss an episode, but we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
This has been a Monkey Pants Productions podcast.